James Carter had been driving for hours, the quiet hum of his car mingling with the soft rhythm of the rain hitting the windshield. It had been a long day, filled with meetings, press conferences, and reports that seemed endless. The weight of being the first black state police chief in the state of Illinois still felt new, like a suit that hadn't been tailored quite right, snug and uncomfortable in places. He'd known his appointment would be historic, but the reality of it was slowly starting to settle in. The streets were empty as James took the back route home, a path he used to take when he wanted to avoid the hustle and bustle of city life. He didn't mind the isolation. There were no expectations here, just the occasional streetlight cutting through the darkness. It was peaceful, and tonight, more than ever, he needed peace. But peace, it seemed, was not on the agenda. As he drove past a quiet residential street, his headlights flashed over a pair of police cruisers parked at an intersection. The flashing lights were the only things that cut through the night. James sighed but didn't think much of it at first. He had been through countless stops before, both as a cop and now as a chief. But tonight, something felt different, something in the air. He slowed down, the engine purring softly beneath him, and took a sharp turn onto the road where the cruisers had stopped. His heart began to beat faster for no particular reason, a strange sense of foreboding creeping into his chest. He rolled down his window as the officer waved him over. It wasn't the usual routine. This time, he could see that the officer had noticed his vehicle before he had even come to a complete stop. The officer approached, the rain dripping off the brim of his cap. James had expected the usual exchange of pleasantries, but there was none of that. Instead, the officer leaned toward the window, squinting at him. The officer was young, early 20s, if that, and had the air of someone who thought they knew everything about policing already, someone who was more eager to prove their authority than do their job. "License and registration," the officer barked, without even a hint of politeness. James paused, surprised at the lack of a greeting. His instincts told him something was off. He wasn't sure if it was the officer's tone or the way the young man was sizing him up, but it didn't sit right with him. He reached for his wallet slowly and handed the officer his documents. "Everything all right, officer?" James asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The officer glanced at the ID and didn't respond. There was something in the way he held the documents, like they were unimportant to him, like they were just another part of the ritual. James felt a surge of unease. His title wasn't listed on his driver's license. It was just his name, his address, his photo. But something about the interaction felt wrong, too casual, too dismissive. The officer's partner approached, a middle-aged man with a permanent scowl etched on his face. He looked at James with an expression that could have come from someone who had dealt with thousands of traffic stops but had long since stopped caring about them. His eyes lingered on James, flicking over him quickly. They didn't just see a man in a car, they saw a stereotype they had long held on to. James could feel their gaze, cold and judging. "Anything wrong, officer?" James asked again, this time firmer, but his calm demeanor was starting to fade. He had faced far worse situations in his career, but there was something about these officers' attitudes, an implicit disrespect, that made his blood simmer. The younger officer spoke again, his tone now filled with arrogance. "I don't know, maybe we should take a closer look." "You're in a rush, huh?" James felt his stomach churn. It was clear now, this wasn't a routine stop. They didn't know who he was, and that was becoming a problem. He took a deep breath, trying to maintain composure. "I'm not in a rush," James replied, trying to keep the situation neutral. "I'm just trying to get home." The middle-aged officer's eyes narrowed. "You look like you're hiding something. Step out of the vehicle, please." James' body stiffened. Something about the way the officer said it felt like an order he couldn't refuse. His mind raced, he wasn't sure how far this could escalate. He had been stopped countless times before, as both a cop and a civilian. He knew what could happen next. He hesitated for a moment. Did he reveal his identity now, or wait until the situation escalated further? He had to make a choice. "Why don't we just wrap this up? I've got somewhere to be," James said, attempting to de-escalate the situation. But it was clear that the officers weren't listening to reason. The young cop's face twisted with suspicion, and the veteran officer stepped forward, placing a hand on his holster. "You think you're too good to follow the rules?" the older officer asked, his voice dripping with contempt. James' heart skipped a beat. The officers didn't know who he was. They thought he was just another man on the road, another black man they could push around. He could feel the weight of history in the air, the tension in the rain-soaked night. "I'm not trying to cause any trouble," James said slowly, carefully. "But I'm asking you to let me go. I'm not the person you think I am." The officers shared a brief glance, one that confirmed they saw only a black man in front of them, not someone who had earned the right to stand where he was. The younger officer gestured to the older one, as if seeking permission. The older officer grunted. "We'll see about that." And just like that, James knew this wasn't going to be a simple exchange. He had to make a decision: stay calm and let them push him around, or reveal his identity and take the risk of everything blowing up in his face. He wasn't sure if he was ready for the consequences, but the tension was unbearable. He took one last deep breath and spoke the words that would change everything. "I'm the new state police chief," he said, his voice calm but firm, a hint of authority now cutting through the discomfort. The officers froze for a split second, the words not registering in their minds. The younger officer's face turned red, and for a moment, there was silence. The rain continued to fall, but everything felt still. James knew that the next few moments would determine not only his reputation but the future of the department he had just taken charge of. The young officer's lips parted, then closed, as if he wasn't sure how to respond. "State Police Chief," he muttered, confused. It wasn't just disbelief, it was a lack of understanding. He had no idea who James was. James repeated himself, more clearly this time, "I said I'm the state police chief." The older officer's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker in his eyes. He looked James up and down once more, and a strange, dismissive smile crept onto his face. "Sure, and I'm the governor," the officer said sarcastically, his voice thick with mockery. "Get out of the car." James' jaw tightened. It was the last straw. He had tried to keep the situation from escalating, but now there was no going back. He could feel his pulse quicken, the adrenaline kicking in. His decision was made: he would have to take control of the situation, not just for his own dignity, but for the sake of the department he led. With a slow, deliberate movement, James opened the door of his car, stepped out, and faced the officers directly. The young officer took a step back, but the veteran stayed put, his stance unchanged. James stared the older officer down, not with aggression, but with the authority that came from years of hard-earned experience. The officers had no idea who they were dealing with. At that moment, James knew this wasn't just a traffic stop. This was a battle for respect, not just for himself, but for every person of color who had ever been subjected to this kind of treatment. And he would make sure that this moment would never be forgotten. The air crackled with tension as James stood there, the rain still pouring down, waiting for the next move. The day James Carter was appointed as the state police chief, it felt like both a triumph and a burden. For as long as he could remember, his life had been filled with challenges that required him to work twice as hard as everyone else to prove himself. Being raised in the heart of a tough Chicago neighborhood, he was no stranger to adversity. His mother had raised him and his younger brother on her own after his father was killed in a robbery when James was only 7. Despite their struggles, she never let them feel sorry for themselves. "Hard work and integrity, James. That's the only way to change the world," she had often said. Those words stuck with him through his entire life, guiding him as he navigated his journey from the rough streets of the South Side to the prestigious halls of the police academy. But now, as he sat at the helm of the entire state's police force, he realized that this new role carried weight he hadn't fully comprehended until that moment. James wasn't just the first black man to ever occupy the position of state police chief in Illinois. He was also tasked with leading a department long entrenched in an unspoken culture that seemed to thrive on secrecy, bias, and a refusal to evolve. The challenges were monumental. For most of his career, he had worked diligently to rise through the ranks, earning his spot through hard work, but nothing in his past had prepared him for the political and social currents he would face now that he had reached the top. His promotion had been met with applause from some corners, but also deep skepticism from others. He was seen as a token by some, a dangerous reformer by others. And though he had fought hard to prove his qualifications, the whispers never fully went away. The morning he was officially sworn in as the state police chief, he walked into the office with a feeling of both excitement and anxiety. He was a man with a mission that had been shaped by years of personal struggles and professional achievements. But even as he thought of the endless possibilities, there was the unavoidable pressure of being the first black person to ever hold this position in a department dominated by a particular kind of old-school authority. His appointment, while a step forward, was also a reminder of just how much work still needed to be done. That afternoon, James sat in his new office in the heart of the state capitol, looking out over the sprawling cityscape. The office was grand, but it felt cold to him, a symbol of all the power he now wielded, but also a cage that would trap him in the expectations of others. His first week had been filled with meetings, introductions, and endless paperwork, but what stood out the most was the question everyone seemed to be asking: how would he change things? He had inherited a department steeped in tradition, but many of those traditions were outdated, even dangerous. Corruption ran deep in some pockets, and the community's trust in the police was fragile at best. James knew that the work ahead of him would be monumental. His first few decisions were easy, simple changes to the way things had been done. He immediately set up meetings with the head of the diversity task force, the union representatives, and the team that would help him draft reforms. But as the days went by, it became clear that this wouldn't be as easy as flipping a switch. There were people in the department who weren't interested in change. They were comfortable in the way things had always been. James' biggest challenge would come from his own officers, the very people he was supposed to lead. Some had no issue with him personally, but many had issues with his race. The department was filled with officers who were accustomed to a certain type of leadership, and James wasn't it. He knew that the task of transforming the department wasn't just about changing policies, it was about changing minds. As the days passed, James encountered resistance from unexpected sources. The skepticism wasn't just from the old guard in the department, it also came from the younger officers who believed they knew how to do things the right way and didn't appreciate being told that their methods needed to change. Many of them resented the new leadership, feeling that James had been handed the position based solely on his race and not on merit. They were frustrated by the changes he proposed: body cameras, anti-bias training, a focus on transparency and community engagement. To them, these were signs of weakness, not progress. It was during these early weeks that James became more aware of the deep fissures within his own department. The division between officers who supported him and those who resented him became clear. It wasn't just about race, although race was a significant factor. It was about a clash of values, those who believed in the traditional methods of policing and those who saw the need for reform. The atmosphere in the department was tense, and James knew he had to do something to unite his team, or else his leadership would quickly crumble. One morning, James decided to attend a routine roll call at a local precinct. It was a small gesture, a chance to get to know his officers and show them that he wasn't just a figurehead sitting behind a desk. As he stood at the front of the room, he looked at the faces of the officers in the room. Some seemed open to hearing what he had to say, others were skeptical, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. James cleared his throat, trying to project confidence. "Listen," he said, his voice calm but firm. I'm not here to tear everything down. I'm here to make sure this department is the best it can be. But I can't do it without you. We all know that trust between the community and the police has been fractured. I want to rebuild that trust. But it's going to take work from all of us. He could see some of the officers shift uncomfortably, but others nodded. One officer, an older man with a weathered face and a hard stare, spoke up. Rebuilding trust? You think we can do that after everything that's happened? You're new around here. What do you know about the way things work? James didn't flinch. I know that change isn't easy, and I know that some of you don't like the idea of change. But the world is changing, and if we don't change with it, we'll be left behind. The officer looked at him, skeptical. We'll see, he muttered under his breath. That interaction stuck with James. He knew that the officer had a point. The world was changing, and the department was lagging behind. But the deeper issue was the resistance to that change. It was rooted in years of tradition, years of a culture that had been allowed to flourish unchecked. James wasn't just facing an uphill battle, he was facing a system that didn't want to be changed. He knew that if he was going to succeed, he would have to navigate through a labyrinth of politics, egos, and deeply ingrained prejudices. It wasn't long before James began to realize just how difficult his task would be. He faced constant pressure from the media, who seemed to be waiting for him to fail. The public was watching, waiting for him to prove himself, but they didn't understand the full scope of what he was up against. They didn't see the officers who openly questioned his authority, the political figures who whispered about his qualifications, or the old-school officers who refused to follow his lead. One evening, after a long day of meetings, James sat in his office, staring at the list of tasks ahead of him. He had promised change, but the road ahead felt overwhelming. As he sat there, lost in thought, his phone buzzed with a message from his old mentor, a retired officer named Samuel who had been a guiding figure in his career. Remember, James, change doesn't come all at once. It's like planting a tree. You water it, care for it, and then wait for it to grow. James smiled faintly, the words bringing him a small measure of comfort. He wasn't sure how long it would take, but he knew this was his purpose now. The challenges would only continue to mount, but he had made a promise to himself, and to his community, that he would see this through. There was no turning back now. He had to succeed, not just for himself, but for every person who believed that real change was possible. It was with this renewed sense of resolve that James went to bed that night, knowing that the storm ahead would be fierce, but believing that it was a storm he could weather. The following days in the department proved to be a constant battle, one that James Carter wasn't entirely prepared for, despite the extensive experience he had in law enforcement. Though he had been a part of the force for nearly 2 decades, holding every position from patrol officer to captain, being thrust into the role of state police chief was a different kind of challenge. He wasn't just managing day-to-day operations anymore. He was tasked with reshaping an entire institution, an institution with roots that ran deep, stretching far beyond what was visible on the surface. Each morning, as James entered his office, he was met with the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He had to navigate a world where everything he did, every decision he made, would be scrutinized by the media, the public, and, perhaps most dauntingly, by his own officers. He knew that every step he took could either reinforce the status quo or begin to dismantle the system that had existed for generations. But what made it even harder was that the system he was working to change had never been openly questioned. For years, officers had been allowed to operate with little oversight, treating civilians, particularly black civilians, with an unsettling combination of indifference and hostility. This deeply ingrained culture was not something that could be undone in a few weeks, or even months. It was a challenge that could take years to tackle, if it was even possible at all. Despite the enormity of the task ahead, James was determined. He had been preparing for this his entire life, though he hadn't known it until the moment he walked into that office. He had always known that systemic change was not something that would come easily, but now he was faced with it firsthand. Every meeting he attended, every conversation he had with officers, felt like a test. And every day, he found himself walking a fine line between making his reforms and keeping a fractured department from spiraling into disarray. It wasn't long before the cracks in the system started to reveal themselves in troubling ways. Officers began to challenge his decisions, not through formal channels, but through subtle acts of defiance. James had heard the rumors, officers whispering in hallways, questioning his leadership, mocking his desire for reform. But it wasn't until a particular day that it truly became clear just how deep the resistance ran. It was a Thursday afternoon, and James had decided to take a more hands-on approach. He spent the day riding along with some of his officers on patrol, hoping to get a better sense of their concerns and frustrations. The ride-along was part of his initiative to bridge the gap between himself and the rank-and-file officers who felt disconnected from the upper echelons of leadership. James was determined to show them that he wasn't just a figurehead, he was someone who understood their struggles and wanted to make real, positive changes. However, what he encountered on that ride-along shook him to his core. It was a stark reminder of how deeply embedded the old ways were. The officer he rode with, a middle-aged man named Officer Michael Thompson, had been in the department for over 15 years. At first, Thompson was cordial, even eager to engage in conversation with his new chief. But as the hours wore on, James began to sense something off. Thompson's responses grew more curt, more dismissive. He started making little comments under his breath, ones that seemed to mock the changes James had been pushing for, comments about politically correct nonsense, about how the community would never truly respect the police again, and how officers couldn't do their jobs with all the red tape being introduced by new reforms. James had been prepared for this kind of pushback. He had seen it before from officers who were comfortable in the status quo, afraid of the changes that would force them to confront their own biases and preconceived notions. But it was still unsettling to hear it so plainly. He had always been able to compartmentalize his personal feelings when it came to these kinds of challenges, but that day, it was harder than usual to keep the frustration at bay. Later that day, things took a turn for the worse. As they patrolled a neighborhood that had long been the site of tension between residents and the police, they saw a young black man walking down the sidewalk. The man appeared to be in his early 20s, dressed casually, but there was nothing about his behavior that stood out as suspicious. James had seen hundreds of people walking on the street in similar ways. But Thompson's reaction was immediate. Without a moment's hesitation, he slowed the patrol car and began to make a U-turn, clearly planning to stop the man. "Hey, stop the car," James said, his voice low but firm. "What are you doing?" Thompson glanced at him, surprised by the interruption, but said nothing. He completed the turn and pulled up alongside the young man, instructing him to step aside. "Michael, what are you doing?" James repeated, more forcefully this time. "There's no reason to stop him." Thompson finally looked at James, his eyes narrowing slightly. "He's walking down the street at this hour. Could be trouble, Chief. We need to keep an eye on everyone. You know that." James felt the tension in the air thickening. "That's not the kind of policing I want," he said, keeping his tone steady, though inside he was seething. "We don't stop people just because they might be trouble. Not like this." The young man, having heard the exchange, looked at the patrol car warily. James could see the fear in his eyes, fear of the badge, fear of being singled out for something he hadn't done. James felt a pang of guilt for the young man, knowing that this was a reality many people of color faced every day, being stopped, questioned, and treated like a suspect simply because of the color of their skin. It was a cycle that perpetuated distrust and resentment, and James was determined to change it. But the situation was becoming more tense by the second. Thompson seemed unbothered by James's objection, and the young man appeared increasingly agitated. Finally, James made a snap decision. He called for backup on the radio, ensuring that the situation didn't escalate further. Within minutes, another officer arrived on the scene, and after a brief conversation with Thompson, the young man was let go. The moment they drove away, James felt a heavy weight settle on his chest. It wasn't just about the incident, it was about the realization that some officers still didn't understand the gravity of what he was trying to accomplish. In that moment, James saw just how far he had to go. He wasn't just battling the systems of authority within the police force, he was battling mindsets, deeply ingrained beliefs about who belonged in certain neighborhoods, who was a suspect, and who deserved respect. That evening, James retreated to his office, the events of the day replaying in his mind. He thought about his role as the state police chief. He had wanted to lead by example, to show his officers that change was not just possible but necessary. But it wasn't enough to just talk about change. He had to confront it head-on. He had to hold his officers accountable for their actions, even if it meant making enemies along the way. As he sat in the dim light of his office, James knew that the battle ahead would not be easy. He had started this journey with high hopes and a clear vision, but now the reality of what lay before him was undeniable. The work ahead would require patience, resilience, and, above all, courage. Courage to make the hard decisions, courage to confront the harsh truths, and courage to continue fighting for the change he knew was needed, even if it meant facing opposition from every corner of the department. And so, with a heavy heart but a steady resolve, James Carter made the decision to keep pushing forward. He couldn't afford to back down. He couldn't let the resistance win. He had come too far to let this moment slip away. He had a duty not only to his officers, but to the communities they served. It was a responsibility he would carry with him, no matter how difficult the road became. The days following that ride-along continued to challenge James Carter in ways he hadn't anticipated. The tension between him and some of his officers had escalated, and while a part of him knew that this kind of friction was inevitable, it didn't make it any easier to endure. Despite his best efforts to address concerns and provide clarity on the vision he had for the department, there was a distinct, growing sense of division. Some officers had started to outright question his leadership, his decisions, and even his motives. James had always prided himself on his ability to read people, to gauge their reactions and adapt his approach accordingly. But this time, the subtlety of the resistance was laced with something more dangerous: resentment. It wasn't just limited to the younger officers who were set in their ways. James had also found himself at odds with some of the veteran officers, those who had been around long enough to see everything from the perspective of their own entrenched beliefs. For years, they had been trained to view certain communities, especially Black and Latino neighborhoods, with suspicion. They had learned how to deal with troublemakers, how to keep control, how to maintain authority through intimidation, and now, James was telling them to throw all of that away. He was telling them to treat people differently, to question their own biases, and to open their minds to a new, more progressive approach to policing. But for many of them, it felt like an attack on everything they had been taught, everything they believed was necessary for effective law enforcement. The strain was beginning to show in every facet of his leadership. Even when James would gather his team for meetings, there was an underlying tension in the room. Some officers spoke out openly, challenging his new policies with veiled criticisms. Others stayed silent, their body language telling the story of their resistance. But even more troubling was what he couldn't see: whispers behind closed doors, jokes about his inability to enforce discipline in the department, and rumors that he wasn't tough enough to handle the job. James had always been someone who believed in leading by example. He knew that change was a gradual process, but he also understood that his actions had to speak louder than his words. Still, despite his best efforts, the road ahead seemed more treacherous than he had imagined. There were times when he would come home from work feeling utterly defeated, his mind clouded with doubts about his ability to effect real change in the department. He had spent so many years fighting for this opportunity, and now that he had it, the weight of responsibility was far heavier than he had anticipated. One night, as James sat at his desk in the quiet of his office, his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize, but he answered it anyway. The voice on the other end was familiar. "James, it's Samuel. We need to talk," his old mentor said. Samuel had been one of the first people to believe in him when he joined the force as a young rookie. Over the years, he had become not just a mentor but a father figure to James. Samuel had seen it all, both the good and the ugly sides of law enforcement. He had retired years ago, but he kept in touch with James, offering advice and guidance whenever he could. "Yeah, Samuel, what's going on?" James asked, leaning back in his chair, his fingers rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I've been hearing some things about the department, things that are concerning," Samuel said. "I don't need to tell you that not everyone is happy with the changes you're pushing for. I know you're trying to do the right thing, but be careful. You've got people in there who aren't just resistant, they're actively working against you." James sighed. He had known that the opposition was there, but hearing it from someone like Samuel, someone he respected deeply, made it feel more real, more dangerous. "I know," James replied, his voice heavy with frustration. "But what do I do, Samuel? I can't change things if they won't even listen. And every day I feel like I'm losing the battle." Samuel's voice softened, and for a moment, there was silence on the line. "James, when I was your age, I faced a lot of resistance too. But you've got to understand something, you can't fix this overnight. Change takes time, and it's never easy. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to face setbacks. But you can't back down. The minute you show weakness, the people who oppose you will take that as a sign that they can get away with it. You've got to stay strong. Lead with integrity, and never forget why you're doing this." James knew Samuel was right, but that didn't make the struggle any easier. The hardest part of it all wasn't the pressure from his superiors, the media, or even the community, it was the constant pushback from his own officers. They were the ones who had been sworn to uphold the law, to serve and protect, and yet many of them were now questioning the very principles he was trying to instill. Despite the frustrations, James kept pressing forward. He called for more town halls with the community, trying to foster dialogue between residents and police officers. He pushed for more comprehensive training on implicit bias and de-escalation tactics. He worked on developing mentorship programs for young officers, hoping to create a new generation of law enforcement officials who would approach their work with the same compassion and understanding that he was trying to implement. But the road was not without its obstacles. One of the most significant challenges James faced was the increasing public scrutiny surrounding the police department. The media had always been critical of law enforcement, but now, with a black man in charge, the stakes seemed even higher. Every action he took was under a microscope, and every misstep was magnified. James knew that he couldn't afford to make mistakes, not when the eyes of the entire state were on him. It was during one of the most trying weeks of his tenure as state police chief that James received an unexpected phone call. It was a quiet Saturday morning, and James had been working through the weekend, preparing for a series of high-level meetings. As the phone rang, he didn't recognize the number but picked it up anyway. "Hello?" he answered, his voice weary. "Mr. Carter," the voice on the other end said. "I'm Detective Marie Jacobs from the State Bureau of Investigation. We need to speak with you about an incident that occurred yesterday." James felt his stomach drop. His first thought was that something had happened with one of his officers, but he couldn't imagine what it could be. "Go ahead," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "There's been a situation in North Chicago," Jacobs continued. "A group of officers from your department were involved in an altercation with a civilian. It's being investigated as a potential case of police misconduct. We have reason to believe that one of the officers involved may have been using excessive force." The words hit James like a punch to the gut. Police misconduct was the last thing he needed, especially with the department already on edge from his reforms. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Do you have names?" he asked, his mind racing. Jacobs gave him the details. James knew two of the officers involved. Both had been with the department for years and had previously shown no signs of misconduct. This wasn't the kind of incident he could ignore. It was precisely the type of behavior he had been working to eliminate. "I'll be there immediately," James said, his tone resolute. He had to confront this head-on. As he drove to the scene of the incident, his mind was filled with a mixture of anger and fear. How could this happen under his watch? How could officers sworn to protect the community act this way? He knew that the path to reform would be long, but this was the first true test of his resolve. How he handled this situation would send a message not only to his officers but to the entire state. This was no longer just about changing policies, it was about changing lives, about proving that real leadership meant confronting uncomfortable truths, even when it was the hardest thing to do. When James arrived at the scene, he was met by Detective Jacobs, who led him to the area where the altercation had taken place. He could see the damage, the signs of a violent confrontation. It was clear that things had gotten out of hand, and he wasn't sure yet how far the officers had gone. But he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't let this incident slide. Not now, not ever. James stood still for a moment, taking it all in. He wasn't just the state police chief now. He was the embodiment of everything the department could become or everything it could remain if he failed. The responsibility was immense, but in that moment, as he stood on the street corner, he realized that no matter how many challenges lay ahead, he could never back down from what he had set out to do. It wasn't just about policing, it was about integrity. It was about justice. And it was about making sure that everyone, no matter their race or background, could feel safe when they saw the badge. The question now was whether he could make that vision a reality. The investigation into the altercation in North Chicago was a pivotal moment for James Carter. As he walked through the scene, his mind raced with questions. He knew this was a test of his leadership, a moment that could either solidify his place as a reformer or shatter everything he had worked for. The altercation, which had resulted in the hospitalization of a young black man, was the kind of incident that sparked outrage in communities, and James couldn't afford to let it slide. The officers involved in the incident, though longtime members of the department, had crossed a line he had been working to ensure would never be crossed again. He met with Detective Jacobs, who briefed him on the preliminary findings. "It's clear that excessive force was used," Jacobs said, her voice steady but with an edge of concern. The victim, a 22-year-old named Marcus Thompson, was approached by Officer Daniel Cole and Officer Peter Wallace during a routine stop. From the video footage we've gathered, it appears that Thompson was cooperative at first, but when he started asking questions, the situation escalated quickly. Both officers used physical force, and the situation deteriorated rapidly. James listened intently, trying to maintain his composure, but inside he was seething. He had spent so long trying to push for reform, trying to change the culture of the department, only to have this happen under his watch. What made it worse was that the officers involved were ones he had trusted, officers he had thought of as professionals. The reality that they had acted in such a way shook him to his core. "I need a full report, and I want to speak with the officers involved immediately," James said, his voice colder than he intended. "We're not sweeping this under the rug. Not now. Not ever." As Jacobs nodded and went to arrange the necessary meetings, James walked through the neighborhood, the same streets where the incident had occurred. The community was understandably upset. People whispered among themselves, casting wary glances at the police officers in the area. He could feel their eyes on him, sensing that many were unsure of whether his promises for change were genuine or just words. The weight of their doubt was heavy on his shoulders, but he couldn't let it deter him. The next few hours were a blur of meetings and phone calls, and by the time James sat down with Officer Cole and Officer Wallace, his mind was focused and sharp. He couldn't let the anger he felt cloud his judgment, but neither could he let them off the hook. These were not just officers who had made a mistake, they had taken actions that threatened the very fabric of the relationship between the police and the community. It was a breach of trust that would take years to rebuild. James sat across from them, the room quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. He met their gazes, unwavering, before speaking. "I've seen the footage. I've read the reports. There's no excuse for what happened," he said, his voice steady but filled with authority. "You were sworn to protect and serve, not to intimidate or harm. What you did was an abuse of power, and that cannot, and will not, be tolerated under my watch." Both officers shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Cole, a seasoned officer in his late 30s, spoke first. "Chief, you don't understand. This kid was being difficult. He wasn't listening to us. We were just trying to do our job." James felt his pulse quicken. He had heard it all before. The excuses, the justifications, the belief that they were in the right because they wore a badge. It was the same rhetoric that had perpetuated police violence for years, and it was this mentality that he was trying to break down. "No, Officer Cole, you're wrong. You don't escalate a situation like that just because someone questions you," James said, his voice calm but firm. "That's not policing. That's power abuse. And you're better than that. I believed you were better than that." The room was heavy with tension as Officer Wallace, the younger of the two, spoke up. "We were just doing our job, Chief. We were trying to control the situation." "Control?" James repeated, his voice rising slightly. "Is that what you call it? Control? You don't control people. You protect them. You serve them. Your job is not to dominate every situation, but to understand it, to de-escalate it. Do you understand what that means?" Wallace lowered his gaze, his face flushed with a mixture of shame and frustration. Cole, however, remained defiant. "With all due respect, Chief, you're asking us to do something that's unrealistic. In situations like that, you don't have time to think about being gentle. You make split-second decisions." "I understand split-second decisions, Officer Cole," James said, his voice now filled with resolve. "But those decisions must always be grounded in respect for the people you serve. You can't just use force whenever you feel threatened. That's what has led to the breakdown in trust between this department and the communities we serve. That's what I'm trying to fix. And if you can't understand that, if you can't change the way you think about your role, then maybe you don't belong in this department." There was a long silence before Cole spoke again, his voice softer this time. "I get it, Chief. I do. But I don't know if I'm the right fit for this new direction. Maybe I've been doing this too long, you know." James didn't respond right away. He knew what this meant. Cole was a veteran officer, and the idea of him stepping away was a blow to the department, but it was also an opportunity. James needed officers who were committed to reform, who understood the gravity of the work ahead. He needed officers who would be willing to put aside their old ways of thinking and embrace a new vision for policing. "I appreciate your honesty, Officer Cole," James said quietly. "But if you're not willing to embrace the changes we need to make, then maybe it's time for both of us to reevaluate what we're doing here." The conversation with the two officers marked a turning point for James. He knew that these were the kinds of moments that would define his legacy, but they were also the kinds of moments that carried an incredible amount of risk. The department had already been shaken by the altercation, and any further action, whether it was suspending the officers or pursuing criminal charges, would only stir the pot even more. There would be backlash, no doubt, but James had made up his mind. He would stand by the community, by the values he believed in, no matter the cost. That evening, after the meetings had concluded, James sat alone in his office, looking out the window at the city lights. He thought about Marcus Thompson, the young man whose life had been irrevocably changed by the actions of two officers. It would be easy for James to focus on the fallout, the anger from the community, the opposition from within the department, but he couldn't afford to lose sight of the bigger picture. He had made a promise to Marcus, to the community, and to himself that this would not be the kind of department that tolerated abuse of power. It wasn't just about punishing the officers involved, it was about sending a message that things were changing. The decision James made that night would have rippling effects across the department. He decided to suspend both officers pending further investigation, a move that would undoubtedly stir more resistance. But he also knew that it was the right decision. It was a stand for accountability, a stand for justice, and a stand for the values that had brought him to this point. As the days passed, the investigation continued, but James knew that the real work was just beginning. The department was at a crossroads, and he had to guide it through the rough waters ahead. He had no illusions about the challenges he would face in the months and years to come. But as he looked out over the city, he knew that he had made the first crucial step toward a future where every officer in the department would be held accountable for their actions, where every community would feel heard, respected, and protected. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but for the first time in the weeks that followed, the fallout from the incident continued to grow. The suspension of Officer Cole and Officer Wallace sent shockwaves through the department. Many officers were outraged, believing that their colleagues were being unfairly targeted. Others, particularly those who had silently supported the changes James had been advocating for, felt a sense of relief. But the divide was unmistakable. The tension between the reform-minded officers and the more traditional, resistant ones reached a boiling point. Whispers of distrust spread like wildfire, and James knew that the future of the department was now more fragile than ever. Public sentiment, however, was different. Community activists, local leaders, and residents who had long criticized the department for its treatment of black and minority communities rallied behind James. They saw the suspension as a sign that the new chief was committed to rooting out corruption and abuse. Local media outlets, which had previously been skeptical of James' ability to effect change, began to cover the story with a more favorable light. Police chief stands for accountability, one headline read. But even with the positive media coverage, James knew he had to walk a tightrope. The story was far from over, and the pressure on him was mounting. Time, James Carter felt hopeful. Marcus Thompson, the young man at the center of the altercation, became a symbol for many who felt disenfranchised by the police. His family spoke out, calling for justice and demanding that the officers involved be held accountable. The community rallied behind them, staging peaceful protests and pressuring local government officials to take action. The incident, which had started as a routine stop, had become a flashpoint in the ongoing struggle for police reform. James couldn't ignore the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about one altercation, this was about a systemic issue that had plagued law enforcement for generations. Meanwhile, within the department, the pressure was beginning to crack the foundation of the reform efforts James had worked so hard to build. As he worked tirelessly to push his vision forward, more and more officers began to voice their discontent. Some openly defied his policies, while others simply went through the motions, showing no true commitment to the changes James had outlined. It was becoming increasingly clear that some of his officers saw his reform efforts as a personal affront to the way they had always done things. James wasn't blind to the pushback. He knew that deep-rooted change couldn't happen overnight, but he also understood the stakes. If he allowed the resistance to fester, if he didn't address it head-on, the department could spiral back into the same patterns of abuse and neglect he had been trying to eradicate. He began holding more private one-on-one meetings with key officers, trying to understand their concerns and fears. These conversations were never easy. Some officers expressed their frustrations openly, accusing him of being naive, of believing that civilians could somehow understand what it was like to be on the streets. Others were more subtle, offering veiled criticisms of his leadership. During one of these meetings, Captain Marcus Hill, a 20-year veteran of the force and a staunch defender of traditional policing, finally spoke up. James, Hill began, his voice rough with years of authority, you're making a mistake. This department has always been about control. That's what we do. We control the streets. We don't coddle criminals. You can't change that. Not in a few months, not in a few years. You've got to understand, some of us don't want to change. James' heart sank as Hill spoke. The captain wasn't just resisting change, he was actively rejecting it. Hill's words were a stark reminder that not all officers would be willing to embrace the reforms James had introduced. For every officer who was on board with the new vision, there was another who saw it as a direct challenge to the authority they had spent their careers building. But James didn't back down. I understand where you're coming from, Marcus, he said, his voice steady. But this isn't about coddling criminals. It's about protecting communities. It's about rebuilding trust. You can't just keep doing things the way they've always been done. You know as well as I do that policing in this country has to change. And if you don't see that, I don't know how we move forward. Hill didn't respond immediately. His expression hardened as he crossed his arms, and for a long moment, there was only silence. Then, finally, he spoke again, but his tone had softened slightly. I'm not saying you're wrong, James. I'm saying that I don't think this department is ready for what you're asking of us. You're fighting an uphill battle. Hell, we're all fighting an uphill battle. James nodded slowly. He knew Hill was right. The department, for all its faults and shortcomings, was entrenched in a culture that had been in place for decades. James had to be realistic. He couldn't overhaul the system overnight, and there was no magic solution to fixing years of mistrust and corruption. But he had to try. He had made a commitment to the community, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. As the days turned into weeks, the tensions in the department only grew more pronounced. James began to feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. It was as though every decision he made, every policy change, every public statement, was being scrutinized under a magnifying glass. But there was no going back. He had made his choice, and now it was about seeing it through, no matter the cost. The investigation into Marcus Thompson's case continued, and the pressure to take decisive action against the officers involved only intensified. James knew that suspending Cole and Wallace had been the right decision, but there was still the looming question of what would happen next. Would they face criminal charges? Would they be fired? The investigation was ongoing, but James could already see the writing on the wall. If he didn't act quickly and decisively, the backlash could derail everything he had worked for. The day the findings of the investigation were finally made public, James called a press conference. The room was packed with reporters, their cameras flashing as they clamored for attention. He could feel the weight of the moment as he stood before the microphone, ready to announce the department's next steps. The eyes of the state, of the nation, were on him. This was the moment that would define his leadership, the moment that would determine whether his reform efforts would succeed or fail. Good afternoon, James began, his voice calm but resolute. As you all know, the recent incident involving officers Cole and Wallace has been under investigation. As you all know, the recent incident involving officers Cole and Wallace has been under investigation. After a thorough review of the evidence, including video footage, witness statements, and the results of an internal inquiry, I have made the decision to terminate both officers from the department. Their actions were unacceptable, and they violated the principles of professionalism and accountability that we are working tirelessly to establish in this department. The room was silent for a moment, and then the questions began. Chief Carter, do you believe this will be enough to restore trust in the department? One reporter asked. James paused, choosing his words carefully. This is a step in the right direction, he said. But it's not the end. Restoring trust will take time. It will take hard work. But I am committed to doing what it takes to rebuild that trust with the communities we serve. Another reporter pressed, what do you say to those who argue that these changes are too radical and that you're alienating the officers who have been with the department for years? I say to them that change is never easy, James replied, his voice steady. But it's necessary. We cannot continue down the path we've been on. We have to evolve. We have to adapt. We have to be better. As the press conference ended and the reporters began to file out, James felt a sense of relief, but it was fleeting. The real work had just begun. The department would need to heal, and James knew that it would take time and a commitment from everyone, officers, community members, and leaders alike. But he also knew that this was the beginning of something important. He was starting to see the possibility of real change. Back at the department, James reflected on how far he had come since taking the position. The challenges were immense, and the road ahead remained uncertain. But as he looked out at the officers in his department, some still resistant, others tentative but willing to learn, he knew that the fight for reform was far from over. It wasn't just about policing, it was about creating a system that worked for everyone, a system built on trust, accountability, and respect. And though the road would be long and fraught with obstacles, James Carter was prepared to continue walking it, one step at a time. As he sat at his desk late that evening, James received an unexpected phone call. It was from Marcus Thompson's family. They had heard about the decision to terminate the officers involved in the incident, and they wanted to thank him. Their gratitude was overwhelming, and in that moment, James felt the weight of everything he had been fighting for. He wasn't just a police chief anymore, he was part of something much bigger, part of a movement that was trying to change the very fabric of policing in the country. And though the journey was far from over, he felt more determined than ever to continue the fight for justice and reform. The story of Marcus Thompson, and the actions taken in response to the incident, would be remembered as a turning point, not just for James, but for the department and the community. It was a reminder that change, though difficult and slow, was possible. But it also served as a warning, that the work was far from finished, and the fight for justice would require vigilance, courage, and an unwavering commitment to making things right.